Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. Today, we are immersing ourselves in a single chilling document, a 16th century royal treatise that argues, with absolute ferocity, for the reality of the devil and his agents on earth.
This isn't just some dusty old book.
No, not at all. This is King James I's Demonology, and it's a shocking blueprint for spiritual and legal thought that literally shaped centuries of history. We're not just talking about old superstitions here.
We're diving deep into the theological mind of a king who believed the entire moral, political, and even the physical order of the world rested on one single truth.
The devil must be real.
Exactly. And our mission today is to understand how James they took this growing trend of skepticism, the denial of spirits, and declared it a direct, unforgivable assault on the very power and authority of God himself.
The logic is just so rigid. If the devil is an illusion, the king argued, then God's entire design is diminished. We're going to trace that logic, and then we're going to see the horrific consequences as they played out in the real world.
Through the confessions, and the spectacular tortures of the notorious North Berwick witch trials in Scotland.
So prepare to encounter the foundational terror of the witch hunts, articulated by the man who sat on the very throne of both Scotland and England.
It's an extraordinarily important pairing of sources for this deep dive. We're drawing from James's treatise, Demonology, which he wrote in 1597.
And it's structured as a dialogue, right?
Yes, a philosophical dialogue between Philomathus, who is sort of the learner, the stand-in for you, the listener, and Epistemon, who is the expert voice of the king himself.
The one who knows.
The one who knows. And then we connect that theory to practice using this incredible contemporary account, News from Scotland, which was published just a few years earlier in 1591.
Right.
It details the real-life trials.
And the king's motivation for writing this, it was profoundly personal and very political. It goes way beyond just intellectual vanity.
Oh, completely. He states it so clearly. He said he didn't write it to Saru for a show of my learning and engine. He said he was mood of conscience.
He felt it was his kingly duty to resolve the doubting hearts of many in his kingdom who were being swayed by this, modern skepticism.
And that resolution was intended to be definitive. It was meant to prove two things, two theological and legal necessities. First, that such devilish arts have been and are real.
Meaning these aren't delusions or madness. These are true spiritual transactions.
Precisely. And second, that those who practice them deserve exact trial and severe punishment. The structure of the treatise itself, it just maps out the entire field. Book 1 is the philosophy, magie, and necromancy.
Book 2 gets into the real social menace, sorcery, and witchcraft.
And Book 3 tackles spirits and specters. It leaves, absolutely no room for ambiguity.
But to understand the severity, the absolute finality of his conclusions, we have to start with the source of his anxiety.
The rise of denial.
The rise of denial.
Yeah.
This entire work is a polemic. It's an attack aimed squarely at contemporary figures who are daring to question the very possibility of witchcraft.
Exactly, and he names them, which just shows how serious he took this intellectual threat. He rails against what he calls the damnable opinions of two, principally in our age.
And the first is an Englishman, Reginald Scott.
Right. Scott, who James says was not ashamed in public print to deny that there can be such a thing as witchcraft. Scott was essentially arguing it was all delusion or fraud.
And the second?
A German physician named Johann Wierus. James claims Wierus set out a public apology for all these craftsfolks, basically arguing that the accused were often mentally ill, victims of melancholy. They deserved pity, not persecution.
So these skeptics weren't just saying prove it. They were actually providing alternative natural explanations for things that were traditionally blamed on the devil.
They were. And James's counterattack elevates this from a simple legal debate into a full-blown theological emergency. He writes that these spirit deniers maintain the old error of the Sadducees in denying of spirits.
And that's the core we have to analyze.
That's everything. James first asserts that denying the power and the reality of the devil is, fundamentally, denying the power and the magnitude of God. The entire legal machinery of the witch hunts, all of it, flowed from this one non-negotiable theological premise.
If Satan doesn't exist,
then Christianity, and by extension the divine right of kings, it all just loses its coherence.
Okay, let's unpack this central theological battle, because it really is the linchpin of the whole thing. James frames the reality of witchcraft as this non-negotiable Christian truth. It's proven not just by confession, but by scripture and daily experience. So for the king, what was the definitive scriptural evidence that spirits and therefore witchcraft must exist.
Well, he built this kind of four-pillar argument that skeptics, especially within a Christian framework, found incredibly hard to dismantle. The first, and it's the most simple one, was the legal necessity of God's own decree.
Okay.
Epistemon argues that the law of God plainly prohibits acts of magic, stating that the law of God speaks nothing in vain, neither doth it lay curses or enjoin punishments upon shadows.
That's actually a very powerful line of defense. If God makes a law against, boiling a kid in its mother's milk, then kids and mother's milk have to exist.
Exactly.
So if he made a law against witchcraft, then witchcraft has to be real. Otherwise, as James says, God's law is rendered meaningless or vain.
It creates this kind of internal logical trap for anyone who accepts the authority of Scripture. It's brilliant in a way. His second proof points to the demonstration of the devil's power.
Pharaoh's wise men.
Pharaoh's wise men imitating the miracles of Moses. James argues this is crucial because it proves the devil can counterfeit divine power. He can deceive the senses, he can mimic true miracles, and that's the foundational mechanism James uses to explain, all magical effects.
And third, he cites Samuel's devastating rebuke to King Saul. Disobedience is as the sin of witchcraft.
Which really elevates the social status of the sin, doesn't it? If witchcraft were just some ignorant act or a cheap parlor trick, comparing the deep spiritual failing of disobedience to it would be, absurd. It confirms that trafficking with the devil is one of the gravest spiritual transgressions you can make.
So that's the Old Testament.
Okay.
And then he solidifies it with the New Testament.
Right. Simon maketh a man of that craft, and the woman who had the spirit of Python in the book of Acts. These established precedent. But as you said, the trickiest proof, the one the Sadducees of his time really, really relied on, was the story of Saul and the Pythoness.
The woman of Endor who raised the prophet Samuel from the dead.
That's the one.
Okay, let's get into that, because this is where the intellectual fight against the skeptics was really won or lost. The skeptics had three pretty strong counter-arguments against the claim that she genuinely raised Samuel's spirit, didn't they?
They did. First was the psychological argument. Saul was, guilt-ridden. He was fasting. He was distracted. He was easily fooled by the woman merely feigning of her voice from another room. They were arguing it was fraud. Saul saw nothing.
And second, the theological argument. It couldn't have been Samuel's actual spirit. That would be profane. It would be against the integrity of the righteous dead. Their spirits are in heaven, not at the beck and call of a witch.
Right. And the third, which was the toughest one. The devil cannot foretell the future. Prophecy, genuine knowledge of what's to come, that belongs only to God.
So if the apparition told Saul he would die tomorrow, and then he did, how does that happen without giving the devil a divine power?
And Epistemon, speaking for James, just handles these objections with surgical precision. Against the first point, the possibility of fraud, James actually concedes that Saul might have been in another chamber during the initial conjuration.
Oh, that's interesting.
But, he says, the text plainly states that once the apparition rose, the woman called Saul in, and Saul knew him to be Samuel. James asserts that knowledge implies sight. If Saul had only heard a muffled voice describing an old man with a mantle, he wouldn't have known it was Samuel. Therefore, the visual manifestation had to be real, regardless of whether she was attempting fraud at first. The devil made the vision real.
That's basically forensic textual analysis. He's making a whole theological argument out of one little detail.
Yeah.
Saul knew it, therefore he saw it, therefore the illusion was successful.
Exactly. And on the second point, whether it was actually Samuel's spirit, Epistemon readily, and a little surprisingly, concedes it was not Samuel. He acknowledges that all Christians of whatsoever religion agrees upon that.
So he sidesteps the whole problem of profaning the righteous dead.
He does. Instead, he asserts that the devil is permitted to transform himself into an angel of light to deceive those who run to him. God would never permit the devil to deceive his own prophets, but he suffers those who willfully deceive themselves by turning away from God to fall into their own snares.
So the blame is put back on Saul's lack of faith, his willingness to seek out these unlawful means, not on any inability of God to protect the faithful. It's a very neat way of shifting the moral blame.
It is, and it leads directly into his third most critical refutation: how the devil foretold the future. James grants the fundamental rule. The devil lacks divine prescience. He cannot know all future things. He can't know anything by looking upon God as in a mirror because he's barred from God's presence. This keeps God absolutely sovereign.
But the prophecy came true. Saul died. How did James explain that without giving the devil a divine attribute? I mean, this feels like the logical breaking point.
He avoids it by defining two acceptable ways for the devil to have this limited foresight. The first is just pure accumulated wisdom, almost like a sophisticated form of data analysis. Yeah. The devil has been worldly wise and taught by an continual experience ever since the creation. By observing natural causes, political machinations, the vicissitude of all things worldly, he can shrewdly judge likelihoods and predict short-term natural outcomes with a very high probability. It's foresight based on observation, not divine knowledge.
Okay, that makes sense for predicting things based on human corruption or, natural events. But what about foretelling Saul's specific, immediate military defeat?
And that brings us to the second means, which is perhaps the most politically dangerous for James's era. The devil can be employed by God.
An instrument of God.
If God plans an immediate, inevitable outcome, like the doom of a disobedient king, he can employ the devil as his instrument, his hangman or executioner in that turn. The devil, seeing his own role in the divine plan, is thus foreknowing the immediate outcome, not through prescience, but through being a direct participant in God's judgment.
But doesn't that risk giving too much authority to Satan? If the devil is employed in God's plan, it makes him an agent of divine providence. It seems to blur the line between absolute evil and necessary function. It almost feels like James is sacrificing some theological purity just for narrative closure. He needs that prediction to be true to validate the reality of spirits.
That is the tension right at the heart of the treatise, and it really highlights James's motivation. The need for that narrative closure to preserve the theological order is absolute. If the devil isn't real, then God's actions in the world become chaotic or just. Unnecessary.
By making the devil God's very contrary opposite, James is defining God's perfection.
Exactly. The devil's qualities, falsehood, injustice, cruelty, they provide the essential negative space against which you can admire God's virtues of truth, justice, and mercy.
So if you remove that absolute negative, if you deny the sheer magnitude of the devil's malevolent power, like the skeptics were doing, you simultaneously diminish the magnitude of God's benevolent power and the necessity of divine protection. That's why the denial of spirits is heresy.
Precisely. The treatise states it plainly. Doubtlessly, who denieth the power of the doyle, would likewise deny the power of God if they could for shame. James feared skepticism because he saw it as an attack on the entire Christian moral structure. If spirits just ceased after Christ, as some suggested, the world became fundamentally less spiritually engaged. It confirmed the existence of too many Sadducees, and it undermined the entire moral authority of the Christian king, who claimed to rule by divine mandate.
So that framework established the philosophical necessity of the devil. Now we have to move from the theological abstract to the very practical. How does this devil actually recruit agents on earth? James uses the doctrine of the fall as his entry point, right?
Yeah.
Man has lost God's image and now bears the image of the devil.
The temptation is universal, but the devil, being an expert spirit, he easily spies our affections, and he customizes his approach. It's all based on the individual's social standing and intellectual capacity.
Which is why he carefully categorizes the sin. So while all necromancers and witches are guilty of falling away from God, there's a kind of hierarchy of damnation.
Yes, the sin against the Holy Ghost.
Right.
Only those who act with full knowledge, the great engines, the learned men who have once had a taste of the sweetness of God's mercies, and then knowingly commit wrong against their own conscience, only they are truly committing that unforgivable sin.
Which implies a legal distinction. The poor, ignorant witch, although condemned, might be seen as less culpable than the highly learned necromancer who sold his soul for intellectual power.
That's the idea. And that brings us to his principal division of the diabolic arts: magie or necromancy, and sorcery or witchcraft.
And the devil appeals to two primary human flaws. Magie or necromancy is allured primarily by curiosity in these great engines, learned people seeking secret knowledge and power.
Right. James even notes the etymology, necromancy, prophecy by the dead, which suggests this perverse intellectual quest. These are the rich, the curious scholars.
Whereas sorcery or witchcraft targets the lower classes. It's allured by a thirst of revenge or a greedy appetite of gear.
Greed, often driven by poverty. The motivation is base and immediate. And this leads to that famous vulgar distinction which James called very merry and, in a manner, true.
That necromancers are the devil's masters and commanders, while witches are his slaws.
The illusion of mastery, that's the key. Epistemon very quickly clarifies that the necromancer doesn't command by any inherent power, but only ex pacto by contract. The devil obliges himself to certain trifles, maintaining the necromancer's illusion of control, all to ensure the ultimate prize, the fruition of their body and soul.
It's a temporary delegation of power. The necromancer is the devil's deepest fool.
Absolutely.
So how does the devil set the intellectual, the curious man, down this slippery slope? He starts with what James calls the school for the learned, judicial astrology.
This is such a crucial distinction for understanding 16th century science and morality. James distinguishes between lawful and unlawful knowledge of the stars. Lawful astronomia is the study of the course of heavenly creatures, calculation, charting, prediction of seasons, tides, weather. This is necessary and good.
But the moment they cross that line into astrologia,
The moment they try to apply celestial movements to human morality, politics, and fate foretelling the future of commonweal's fortune and death, it becomes unlawful. Learned men seeking fame and a name beyond natural philosophy, they become obsessed with this unlawful astrology.
and their curiosity just grows.
It becomes insatiable. They believe their studies are so deep that they need a greater power to satisfy it, and so they fall into magi, thinking they can command spirits with their complex circles and conjurations. But James warns that these men who blindly glory of themselves are in fact bondslaws to their mortal enemy. Their intellect is the very mechanism of their destruction.
So the intellectual path is a descent from lawful inquiry to forbidden curiosity, and it ends in spiritual bondage. What about the unlearned who are motivated by hunger or revenge?
Their entrance is through the rudiments. This is defined as the supposed virtue of word, herb, and stone via unlawful charms or frights. These are the common folk practices you'd see in every village.
Like using specific herbs or words to cure the worm or stemming blood.
Or healing animal ailments. Things like horse crooks, interpreting fate by turning a riddle, or binding married folk with knots.
These sound like relatively minor, maybe even harmless folk practices, local superstitions. Why are they the devil's rudiments?
Because when these practices prove true by the power of the devil, the ignorant are lured into believing they possess a genuine inherent power that's beyond God's. The devil works through these small charms to confirm their power, which entices them to seek more knowledge, either privately or by running directly to the devil for greater gain or revenge.
And the devil is delighted to move them away from complex rituals.
Right. Away from the difficile and perilous conjuration circles of a necromancer and toward a plain contract.
The contract is the ultimate simplification of evil. Tell us more about the terms of that contract, which determines the forms and effects.
The contract specifies the shape the devil appears in, and it's adapted to the recipient. For the baser sort, the simple witch, the devil might appear as a dog, a cat, or an ape, a familiar domestic form.
And for the most curious sort, the learned.
He might enter a dead body to give answers about battles or affairs of state. He might even be a continual attender in the form of a page, or be conjured into a tablet or a ring that the magician can carry around, sell, or consult.
And the promised services, the effects, teaching arts, carrying news.
These rely entirely on the devil's inherent nature as a fallen spirit. Teaching arts and sciences is easy for him because he retains all the knowledge gained since the creation. Carrying news from any part of the world is simple due to his agility as a spirit.
And he can reveal secrets.
He can, provided those secrets have already been spoken. Because James is absolutely emphatic about this. The thought none knows but God. This maintains God's sole authority over the human mind. The devil can also provide, fair banquets and dainty dishes, which James assures the reader are not created but simply stolen and instantaneously transported by the devil's agility from a great distance.
So this all boils down to the grand illusion that James has to continually emphasize. The devil cannot truly create. He can only mimic and deceive the senses.
It is the absolute defining limitation. He is God's ape. When he shows the necromancer castles and fortes or fair armies of horsemen, these are but impressions in the air. All the jugglery tricks only deceive the senses.
Let's focus on that distinction one more time because it justifies the whole system. God's miracle, like Moses' rod turning into a serpent, is creation. What appears is real. What was the devil's version with Pharaoh's magicians?
Their rods only seemed to turn into serpents. It was merely an illusion to the senses. The proof, according to James, is that Moses' true, real serpent then devoured the illusions of the magicians. If the devil's serpents had been real, they wouldn't have been consumed by the true creation. The devil is limited to rearranging existing matter or manipulating perception, and this distinction is vital because if the devil could truly create, he would be equal to God, which James cannot allow.
With that contract defined, we move into the specific practices of sorcery and witchcraft. This is focusing on the unlearned, those allured by poverty or revenge. The devil finds his entrée ready, his moment of vulnerability.
Right, when a person is in great ignorance, living an evil life, or is in an utter despair and solitary, he says, walking solitary in the fields, or else lying pantsing in their bed. That moment of isolated desperation is the perfect entry point.
That is an incredibly relatable image, mental distress being exploited for spiritual ends.
And once they agree to his service, the devil first discovers what he is, makes them renounce God and baptism directly, often by spitting upon their hand, and then he seals the bargain
With the devil's mark.
with the mark upon a secret place of their body. And this mark is central to all the legal arguments that follow.
What defines the mark physically, and why is it so important for detection?
Initially, the mark is sore and painful. It's a physical reminder of this intolerable bond they've forged, ensuring the new apprentice doesn't forget. But crucially, after the initial pain subsides, the mark becomes ever insensible to touch or pricking. It loses all feeling.
And that insensibility is the key supernatural sign that the witch finders would look for.
Absolutely. The devil uses this mark to show the witch that he has power over their body, able to hurt and then heal them, which cements their dependence on him.
And once they're initiated, the witches convene. The devil continues his role as God's ape, counterfeiting Christian worship in these gatherings.
He gathers them in great numbers, often noted to be 200 or more, to be taught how to work mischief and advance Satan's tyranny. James even notes they sometimes gather in churches, which demonstrates the maximum level of blasphemy, profaning the very places ordained for Christian worship.
And the adoration rite is one of the most infamously recorded details in the trials that follow.
It is, and James finds it simultaneously ridiculous and profoundly blasphemous. The adoration rite is the kissing of his hinder parts, his buttocks.
Right.
And James notes that this seemingly absurd act is an inverted imitation of Moses, who saw only the hinder parts of God because of the immense glory. The devil, greedy for any form of twist and honor, imitates even this profound spiritual event, perverting it into an act of complete debasement.
Okay, let's talk about interpretation, how they travel to these conventions. James has to be very careful here not to grant the devil too much power, while still accounting for the stories that were told in the trials.
He identifies 3 methods claimed by witches. The first, the natural way riding, going, or sailing, that's easily accepted. The second is the violent aerial way, being carried swiftly by the spirit above the earth or sea. James actually believes this is possible.
Citing biblical precedent, like Habakkuk being carried by an angel.
Exactly, and noting that the devil, being the prince of the air, is capable of more than a natural wind.
But he places strict limits on this aerial method.
He does. It's limited to only a short bounds, corresponding to how long the witch can retain their breath under this violent and forcible manner. They can claim invisibility, which James deems possible if the devil thickens and obscures so the air around them, deceiving the senses of any onlookers.
And the third way, the claim of transformation or spiritual travel, the illusion ecstasy, this is where James draws his firm theological line.
Absolutely. Some claim transformation into a tiny beast or fowl to enter closed passages, like a mouse. Others claim their bodies lie senseless in an ecstasy while their spirits are ravished and transported great distances. James rejects both of these as impossible.
Why is transformation into a mouse directly contrary to itself?
Because transforming and contracting a solid, quantitative body into a tiny space violates the nature of quantity, which is an attribute of creation only God can fully manipulate. James mockingly equates it to the little transubstantiate God in the Papist's Mass.
A direct anti-Catholic political jab.
For sure. He says a solid body cannot be diminished without pain, which would violate the contract, or without fundamentally violating physical law.
And the spiritual transporting, the soul wandering while the body is senseless.
Dismissed as equally impossible. The soul leaving the body is, by definition, natural death, and the devil cannot restore life or allow the soul to wander. Instead, according to James, the devil ravages their thoughts while the body lies senseless. He projects a shared collective dream or vision that deceives their senses while he performs the actual harms simultaneously. The witch just believes they participated via magic.
That is a crucial distinction. It maintains the devil's power to deceive and harm, without granting him God's ultimate creative authority or control over life and death. Now, let's look at the specific harms they effectuate, moving from general curses to targeted death.
The harms are structured around the limits of the devil's power. The devil is an expert in the occult properties of nature, so he might teach them uncouth poisons, composed of natural things, or powders made from dead corpses. But usually he uses illusionary or spiritual means.
affecting emotions, like love or hate.
It's possible, but not by magic that compels the will. The devil, knowing human weaknesses, can persuade the corrupted affection of them whom God will permit him so to deal with. He can prey on existing psychological frailties. Similarly, laying sickness on another is possible, citing Job's suffering as precedent. The devil knows what humor dominates a person and can subtly walk and be the same to bring sickness, if God allows it.
And the most terrifying method, the one most used in the documented trials, was death by picture, the wax or clay effigy.
This relies entirely on that coordinated illusion. The wax picture itself has no inherent power, but the devil works by a simultaneous, subtler spiritual action. As the witch melts the wax, the devil, subtly as a spirit, so weaken and scatter the spirits of life of the patient.
And this coordination causes faintness, sweating.
Debilitating the stomach, making the victim vanish away, even as his picture will do at the fire.
So the devil coordinates the physical effect with the magical ritual, giving the witch the satisfying delusion of control. And finally, the large-scale acts, like storms and tempests, which James himself experienced.
Yes. Raising sudden violent storms upon sea or land, though limited to a particular place, is very possible because the devil is the prince of the air. James distinguishes these short-lived violent storms from natural meteors. Since the devil rules the air, he has the physical ability to stir up great winds and seas again, only if God permits him.
Given the gravity of these spiritual and physical harms, what is the prescribed lawful remedy for those afflicted?
The remedy must be absolutely non-magical. James insists God permits the godly to be troubled, like Job, to test their patience. Their power is small over those with strong faith. The remedy is achieved only by earnest prayer to God, amendment of life, and the sharp persecution of the wicked instruments of Satan.
The witches themselves.
To witches themselves.
It is completely unlawful to seek any form of counter-magic, even for healing.
Explicitly unlawful. It is no ways lawful to use one witch to cure a disease cast on by another witch. This rests on that unyielding theological axiom, nunquam faciendum est malum vitae bonum inde veniat.
You should never do evil, so that good may come of it.
Never. Seeking healing through the devil's means will only lead to the eternal damnation of the patient's soul, regardless of the temporary physical cure.
Before we see James's theology tested in the crucible of the North Berwick trials, he addresses a few specific types of spiritual manifestation that were popular in folk belief. He needs to either legitimize them or debunk them.
Right. First, the fairy, or the good neighbors. This type of spirit was rife in the time of papistry. People were deluded into believing they saw a king and queen of fairy, that they rode with them to a hill and received stones with special virtues. James just dismisses this as illusion, similar to the spiritual ravishing of witches.
But he still says they should be punished.
Oh, yes. He stresses that those who prophesy by the fairy should be severely punished, as they're trafficking in deception and feeding false hope.
And what about the werewolves? The lycanthropoi men who believe they transform into wolves.
He dismisses physical transformation as impossible, again, because it contradicts the nature of quantity. He concludes that these individuals are likely victims of a natural superabundance of melancholy, which makes them think they're beasts, like Nebuchadnezzar in the Bible. They act out this delusion, running on hands and feet, fighting dogs. Any claims about finding their hard, shell-like sloughs he rejects as just unreliable gossip, added by the author of all lies.
However, James does accept the reality of the rowdy possessed, the demoniacs. How does he differentiate these from natural madness or simple hysteria?
He provides 3 clear, irrefutable symptoms, and he consciously excludes what he calls the vain signs that the papists attributes vain to it, like raging at holy water, which he suspects are often clerical frauds.
So what are his 3 reliable symptoms?
First, incredible strength, exceeding the combined strength of 6 strong men. Second, unnatural swelling and agitation of the breast and belly, with sinews of such irony hardness that it's impossible to prick the skin.
And third?
Speaking in sundry languages the patient never learned, in an uncouth and hollow voice, with a greater physical motion in the chest than in the mouth itself.
That third point, speaking in unknown languages, that's a classic sign, often noted historically. Now, the existence of the possessed brings up a very thorny political and theological question for a Protestant king.
If papists are heretics, how can they cast out devils?
Exactly. It's a major challenge to James's authority because the Catholic Church often used exorcism as proof of their spiritual superiority.
And James argues 2 things. First, he maintains that most of the papist cures are counterfeit wiles of the clergy. or that the devil willingly releases the possessed person for a short time to hurt the souls of many, confirming them in the erroneous Catholic religion through a false miracle.
But what if, against his suspicion, a genuine exorcism by a papist is successful?
Then James grants that if they can do it, the efficacy is solely due to the divine method taught by Christ to his apostles: fasting, prayer, and invoking the name of God. The efficacy comes from God, not the instrument, not the person or the church.
He uses the example of Judas.
He uses the powerful example of Judas Iscariot, who had the power to cast out devils despite his own sin and impending betrayal. The divine power isn't corrupted by the person's other doctrinal errors. This allows James to preserve the Reformed faith's spiritual superiority while still accounting for success outside his church.
And with the theory complete, we finally turn to the source material that validated the king's entire worldview: the North Berwick trials. The news from Scotland gives these vivid, horrifying details, starting with Gailis Duncan.
Gailis Duncan was a maidservant who was performing these seemingly miraculous cures. Her master, David Seaton, suspected unlawful means because the practices started so suddenly. When he pressed her, she refused to confess.
And the account details the methods used to make her confess.
It does. Torture, including the pillowinks on her fingers and her head twisted with a cord. But she only confessed after they searched her body for the devil's mark.
The discovery of the mark was the key turning point in the legal process.
It was. The mark, that insensible point, was found in her forecrag, the forepart of her throat. Once they located it, she immediately confessed everything was done by witchcraft, and then she accused Agnes Sampson, the elder witch, and Dr. Fian, the coven's register, among many others. She established the existence of a major coven.
And Agnes Sampson was then brought directly to Holyrood House and examined by the king himself. This is the moment James I's intellectual curiosity became absolute conviction.
It is the single most critical anecdote in the entire history of the Scottish witch trials. Agnes Sampson confessed, but the king remained stubbornly skeptical, perhaps believing she was just repeating a story dictated by fear.
So to convince him,
she took James aside and whispered a secret only 2 people in the entire world could have known. The very words that passed between the king and queen at Upslo in Norway on their wedding night.
that intimate, unknowable detail, the supernatural proof of a demonic conspiracy.
The king was utterly astonished and terrified. He swore by the Lyrian god that he believed that all the dills in hell could not have discovered the same, and he immediately gave the more credit to the rest of her confessions. That single detail served as divine validation for his entire theological framework.
And what further confessions did Agnes Sampson offer about the coven's activities?
She confessed they sailed to North Berwick Kirk in riddles or sieves, making merry and drinking wine along the way, accompanied by 200 witches. Gailis Duncan led the procession playing a Jew's trump.
And at the church?
At the church, the devil appeared in the likeness of a man, received their oaths, and, most critically, did greatly inveigh against the King of Scotland, calling James the greatest enemy he hath in the world. The coven's purpose was explicit regicide.
The political stakes could not have been higher. What were the 2 specific ritualistic attempts they confessed to making against the king's life?
The first involved poisoning and a kind of spiritual weakening. They tried to kill James using a black toad. They hung the toad up by its heels for 3 days to collect venom in an oyster shell.
And they intended to apply this venom to a piece of his linen cloth.
A shirt or a handkerchief, which they tried to get from a chamber attendant. Had they succeeded, they intended to bewitch him to death, putting him to such extraordinary pains as if he had been lying upon sharp thorns and endies of needles.
That detail about the agonizing, pain-sharp thorns and needles, that aligns perfectly with James's description of how the devil weakens the spirits of lice of a patient. What was the second attempt? The maritime disaster.
They took a cat and christened it, an act of extreme blasphemy, bound it with parts of a dead man, and cast it into the sea. This rite caused a massive tempest, so severe it sank a boat carrying gifts for the queen. More critically, this christened cat was the cause that the king's own ship, returning from Denmark, had a contrary wind to the rest of his ships, even though his whole fleet was sailing together.
And they confessed he only survived because his faith was stronger than their intentions.
Exactly. His faith had not prevailed about their intentions.
This confirmed James's deepest beliefs. His survival wasn't luck or natural fortune. It was direct divine intervention protecting the godly king against a very real demonic plot.
It completed the self-reinforcing circle. The king writes the book, asserting the devil's reality. He experiences the plot, and the trials confirm the plot, using supernatural evidence, the secret words that validates the entire judicial and theological system.
Now let's discuss the fate of Dr. Fian, the Coven's Register, whose resistance led to the most detailed descriptions of torture in the document.
Dr. Fian was the learned necromancer, the one James would consider culpable of the sin against the Holy Ghost. Initial torture, using the rope around the head and that horrific crushing device, the boots, failed to elicit a confession. The other witches suggested searching his tongue,
And they found 2 pins thrust into his head.
which they claimed was a charm that was stinting his ability to confess.
After the pins were removed, he confessed everything. He vowed a Christian life only to inexplicably escape and return to his home.
His immediate recapture and his denial of the previous confession, it infuriated the king, who believed Fian had successfully renewed his league with the devil. James ordered extreme measures to force the truth from him.
And these measures were described with terrifying specificity.
They were shocking. First, his nails were ripped off with an instrument called a turkis pincers. Then 2 needles were thrust in under every single nail, or even up to the heads. I mean, it must have been agonizing beyond comprehension.
And yet he remained obstinate in his denial.
He was then put back in the boots until his legs were utterly crushed and beaten together as small as might be, and the blood and marrow spouted forth in great abundance. Even after the sustained, horrifying abuse, Fian only denied everything. He said his initial confession was only done and said for fear of pains which he had endured.
So in the eyes of the court, this final denial just confirmed that the devil had hardened his heart absolutely.
Absolutely. He was judged, strangled, and burned in Edinburgh in January 1591.
It is chilling to realize that the king's intellectual blueprint was being executed on real bodies with such specific, agonizing instruments, all justified by a theological imperative. What was the final justification for this severe punishment?
The punishment is death, usually by fire, as the sin is deemed the highest point of idolatry. No sex, age, or rank is exempted. And James argues that the magistrate who spares a guilty witch commits a sin comparable to Saul sparing Agag. He essentially makes the judge guilty of a sin comparable to the sin of witchcraft itself.
So to aid the magistrate in this grave duty, James provided 3 supernatural signs for trial, signs that God provides to discern the guilty from the innocent.
Yes. Besides finding the devil's insensible mark, the second sign is floating on water. The principle is that water, having been sanctified in baptism, refuses to receive into its bosom those who have willfully rejected that sacred water through their pact with the devil.
And the third, which must have placed extreme psychological pressure on the accused women.
Witches are unable to shed tears, even when threatened or tortured, because God prevents them from dissembling their obstinacy. James specifically notes this regarding the women kind especially, be able other ways to shed tears at Uri light occasion when they will. This lack of tears is viewed as a divine sign of the absolute hardening of the heart by the devil.
So the increasing number of witches in James's time, which prompted this entire treatise, was therefore taken as a sign of something much larger than just local crime.
It confirmed James's eschatological view. The causes are twofold: the great wickedness of the people by which God justly punishes sin, and more significantly, the approaching consummation of the world. He believed our deliverance was drawing near, which makes Satan to rage the more in his instruments, knowing his kingdom to be so near an end.
For James I, the explosion of witchcraft was confirmation that he was ruling in the last days. It justified his severe judicial response as a final righteous stand against the forces of damnation.
Yes, that's it exactly.
We've navigated the intricate, terrifying logic of King James I's demonology, seeing how a monarch fused detailed theology, scriptural proofs, and the horrific reality of the Scottish trials to create this totalizing system. For James, questioning the devil's reality was tantamount to denying God, and the judicial response was a necessity to maintain Christian order.
This deep dive really shows that King James I viewed the rise of intellectual skepticism as an existential threat. The source material is unequivocal. The devil is the very contrary opposite to God. If you remove that powerful counterpoint, the definition of God loses its clear contours, and the necessity of divine authority, and therefore monarchical authority, is diminished. James was fighting to maintain an absolute theological definition that ensured his kingdom remains stable and morally defensible.
He structured the entire world, from the macro of storms and tempests down to the micro of a single insensible mark on the throat of a servant girl, as a field of battle between God and the devil. with the Christian monarch as the divinely appointed protector.
And that leads us to the final provocative question. If James VI's entire legal and theological framework was built on a necessity of the devil's power to define God's power, what happens when skepticism, or the old error of the Sadducees, truly takes hold? Consider this. If the detailed mechanics of the devil's recruitment, the grand illusions, and the regicidal plots were in fact just the collective delusion of desperate and tortured people, what happens to the concept of absolute spiritual justice? If the reality of evil is only psychological rather than metaphysical, does that mean the entire foundation of divine judgment, which James I saw himself executing, collapses, leaving only human cruelty behind?